Okay, guys, it is 8 p.m. and welcome aboard to the Philosophy Chat. Today I'm going to have Daniel on air, or it is Professor Daniel as of recently. He just now got admitted into his professorship. He's going to be helping us talk about ethics, normative ethics, and a little bit of meta ethics and grounding today. If you could say hi real quick, Daniel, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey everyone. Like Marty said, I did my PhD in philosophy, mainly interested in normative ethics, but I try to have a healthy omnivorous diet. Really interested in issues having to do with the self and other, limits of duty, how morality gets a grip, all that good stuff.
Excellent, excellent. And let me change over to the live camera right now to show the people what types of topics that we're going to go over. Looks like Daniel wanted to do instead of, let's see what I got it under right now. Self and other, instead of that being like the third thing that we go over, it's probably going to be the first thing, since he thinks this is a sort of good segue into doing normative ethics or meta ethics. So some of the thinkers that we're going to go over, I guess, are Thomas Chi Schelling. We're going to go over Derek Parfit. And what was the last one that we're going to go over that you said?
Torek?
Torek?
John Torek? Yeah, well, actually, these first few works that you have up there are a great entry into self and other, but why don't I let you start with a question?
Okay, so I guess, I mean, since we're not doing meta ethics, generally a lot of the types of questions that I kind of begin with in ethics that a lot of people here are curious about are going to be things like how do we deduce categorical imperatives instead of just having hypothetical imperatives. But since you did want to begin and segue, I guess, with the self and other, let's talk about the sort of, as you say, the sort of asymmetry with the self and other. What becomes more important in the types of normative ethics or the ethics that you do? Oop, looks like we got some background noise in the kitchen. And yeah, kind of tell us a little bit about the sort of project or the things that you're interested in, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. So for me, I find it pretty easy to get totally puzzled by questions about how to treat other people, how to treat yourself. So let me give you an example. In Schelling's book, Choice and Consequence, he talks about the difficulty of making choices about other people. Right? So suppose that you're deciding which sorts of treatments to develop for a pandemic, right? And you know for a fact that if you pursue one line of treatment, certain patients aren't going to be able to survive. Or suppose that you're deciding, Schelling's own example involves like saving life. So suppose a mine collapses, and the company is deciding how much money should it be willing to spend to save the lives of the miners who are trapped inside. These questions are brutally difficult. Like it's painful even to put a number on them. $1 million per miner, million and a half, 50,000. I mean, it almost feels like offensive. And it's a funny kind of question because any answer just seems like a pain. But Schelling says, look, it becomes a little bit simpler if you're able to think about it in terms of saving yourself rather than saving another. So imagine that the mining company has a chance to invest in life-saving equipment. How much would it be willing to spend to save people in advance? Well, imagine how much you'd be willing to spend to slightly increase your chances of survival. In fact, we make this choice every day, right? We're willing to take on a risk of dying to drive to the store. Cars are not totally safe. We're willing to forego spending money on the fanciest possible gym memberships and whatever it might be, because we are willing to take a little risk by not having the perfect immune system. We make these trade-offs very easily when it's a matter of what we prefer. I'd rather get to the store on time. I'd rather not be spending all of my time, developing an amazing immune system. I got other things to do. So Schelling points out that a lot of these policy choices are simpler if we're able to imagine them as trade-offs that an individual's making for themselves. That to me is very interesting.
And so I guess the first type of question that a sort of person would ask right here, and maybe you have an answer for us, hopefully this isn't too difficult. When we ask these types of questions of what we do for ourselves and what we'd sort of prefer to ourselves, do you think that that's a sort of fair question that we should assess other individuals as we assess ourselves? Or is there, as you say, a sort of asymmetry between how we should assess ourselves and how we should assess others, particularly within these sorts of examples, like the minor example or maybe a hospital example of some sort, where I have to put a value on someone?
Yeah, that's the perfect question. So I actually am drawn to a way of thinking about these questions where there's a self-other symmetry, right? So I think that the way that you should think about how to treat others is how you would treat yourself if you were in a similar position. And the way you should think about how to treat yourself is how you would treat a relevantly situated other. Now, there is a big problem here. So sometimes you can't treat others the way you treat yourself because there's some situations that you can only stand in with respect to another. So take the miner, right? The miner might want you to spend all the money you have to save their life. And if you would rather spend that money on something else, there's a kind of split between the two of you that just isn't possible in the one person case, right? So if you want to spend the money on something else and they want you to save them, then the person at risk and the person deciding have different preferences.
I see.
And when you see what I mean? So
yeah.
That's a case where like the situation that you would find yourself in, just because you're playing both roles at once, the person to be saved and the person deciding, you can't have the same kind of psychological splits. So when that's happening, I actually think you cannot do the shelling trick because you're in a situation that's very different. So this is a crucial distinction. When you're deciding beforehand what kinds of risks are reasonable to expose yourself to, you're exposing yourself to risk with sort of your own consent. But ex post, right? So suppose no one sees it coming and there's a mine accident. The miner never consented to this danger. And that in a way makes the problem ineluctably difficult. So the beauty of the shelling point is that it reduces this tough question of how to treat others to a question about how to treat yourself, but it's not always available as a move if the other person never sort of had a chance to consent the way that you consent to your own choices.
So I mean, we kind of have a question actually in the chat room that I sort of also wanted to ask. What exactly would be different between this and say just a regular, golden rule in ethics that we should treat others like we treat ourselves?
Yeah, super good question. How's this different from the golden rule? Okay, well, the golden rule, as it's sometimes stated, uses the concept of an imperative, right? It's usually like, treat others the way you'd want to be treated. Or sometimes it's put in terms of should. You should treat yourself, or treat others, sorry. You should treat others the way you would want to be treated. Now, of course, the golden rule has to be qualified, just like the self-other symmetry that I endorse has to be qualified. Famously, if you have certain tastes that they don't have, you shouldn't treat yourself the same way. I like very bitter flavors. Doesn't mean I should put bitter stuff in every meal I make for my flatmate.
Right. That's where it would generally go. Is that there's going to be at least some asymmetry between the types of preferences that we have, but here you're talking about ethical obligations, so it might be a little bit different from preferences of that sort.
Right, but now here's where what I say comes apart from the golden rule, which is, so like I said, the golden rule is usually put in terms of one concept, like an imperative or a should. Mm-hmm. I think there's really two sides to the self-other symmetry. One has to do with what you may do regarding yourself, and the other is what you have to do regarding yourself. So I think you have to treat yourself the way that you treat a non-consenting other. So think about it like this. Do I have to give my kidney? to someone else who needs it more. I mean, intuitively, if other people matter as much as I do, yeah, I should give my kidney. It'd be a good thing. I got a spare, I'm barely using it. Someone else doesn't have they barely have one functioning kidney. They need a donation to survive. Now, do I have to give the kidney? Well, the old school golden rule would probably say, like, look, if self and other are kind of equal, how would you want to be treated in their position? You'd want the kidney, so you should give it. I mean, but that seems super demanding, right? It's my body. Why do I have to give up parts of my body for someone else's greater good? So I think that well, I'm skipping ahead to supererogation here. But I think what we need to think about is the case of stealing a kidney from a third party, right? So if I don't want to give my kidney and someone else needs it more, I don't think it automatically follows from the greater need that I have to give it, because I have a right over my kidney. And you can see this from thinking about the third party case. No one could steal my kidney to give it to the person who needs it more.
So just a quick definition for the audience, just about supererogation and sort of your definition, so the audience may know as well, Daniel, if you don't mind.
Of course, yeah. So supererogation comes from the Latin version of the Good Samaritan story. It's the idea of going above and beyond the call of duty. Terrible, terrible, too many words, too many letters in this word. It's supererogation. It basically means something like, jump in on the grenade to save your partners, donating your kidney to someone who needs it more, donating to charity if you were allowed to spend it on yourself. All those kinds of things that are better than a permissible alternative.
I see. So with the concept of supererogation then, and doing more than one is responsible for, one might say then this kind of violates the sort of symmetry that you were talking about, because one would generally not do more than what they need to do for themselves. So why would one want to do more than one would want to do for themselves for others? Unless one is saying that a priori one needs to do more than themselves than it's generally required. But that sounds kind of unintuitive, doesn't it?
It does sound unintuitive. I think you put your finger on a really interesting tension in the way that we think about self and other. So just to bring this out with some more examples. On the one hand, it seems like I'm permitted to treat myself as more important than other people. So other people need a kidney, I got a spare, and yet intuitively, if it's my body, I'm allowed to treat my own interests as more important. I can keep the kidney. But on the other hand, it seems like sometimes I am less morally sacrosanct than other people, right? If I just go up to you and pinch you on the arm, it's not a serious moral wrong, but it's morally wrong. Yeah, I shouldn't do that. If I pinch myself on the arm, even if I pinch it kind of hard, it's not morally wrong. Maybe you might ask, why did I do that? Not a smart thing to do if it hurts. But in general, it seems like it's much, much, much harder to wrong yourself than it is to wrong other people, which means that it kind of suggests like you have less moral status from your own point of view than other people do. That is super puzzling, especially if you're thinking from a kind of golden rule point of view. I wouldn't want to have my arm pinched by somebody else, but it's permissible for me to pinch my arm. I would want a spare kidney from somebody else, but they don't have to give me the kidney. So that's the puzzle. That's the deep puzzle of self and other in this part of ethics. And a lot of my work has been trying to find not just solutions to these two puzzles, but a unified solution.
I see. So I definitely get the sort of relationship that you said earlier, the sort of asymmetry, at least one type of asymmetry, that it's easier to sort of violate other people than it is to violate yourself, because there's all sorts of things that wouldn't bother us if we did them to ourselves, like pinching. I think that makes some sort of sense, but I guess to ask another sort of question, then I'll go to some of the questions within the audience right here, because we always have some over here. Do you have any sort of arguments that you think might show that we should value self and other symmetrically? That is, around the same value, or is this sort of an intuitive pump of some sort? I mean, what are we exactly dealing with here?
I do have an argument. So the view that my argument attacks is the self-other asymmetric view, right? The asymmetric view says, usually it starts with cases like the kidney donation case. Why are you allowed to keep your kidney even though someone else needs it more? Because you yourself matter more from your own point of view. This is what Sam Scheffler says. And it's what what Derek Parfit says in Enumerate Ethics.
Mm-hmm.
He says, look, there's just a big difference between your own welfare and their welfare. You have agent relative reasons to care extra about yourself. I think this would solve the puzzle of why you get to keep your kidney, but it makes the puzzle of why you're allowed to pinch your arm insuperable, right? If you matter just like other people but more, then it's very puzzling why it shouldn't be even more wrong to pinch your own arm than pinch somebody else's. And Parfit struggled with this puzzle until the end of his life. I mean, not pinching in particular, but in general, why aren't you obligated to give yourself benefits?
Okay.
So that's the view I don't like, and the problem with it is that if you solve the puzzle of why you're allowed to keep your kidney, you seem to make it harder to deal with the question of why you're allowed to pinch your arm. But here's the view that I develop. I say, look, don't start with the question, what should I do with my kidney? Start with a case involving someone else. Again, self-other symmetry, right? So imagine, are you allowed to steal a kidney from me because a third party needs it more? And what's the answer? I mean, no, right? Morally, it's wrong to steal from somebody, even for the slightly greater good. But then, so that why? Presumably because it's their kidney and they get some say over what happens to it. They have a kind of veto power over the collective good. But if they have a veto power when it comes to someone else taking out their kidney, shouldn't they also have a veto power over the question of whether they have to take out their kidney? Right. So my argument, that's the nutshell version of the argument. My argument starts from the idea that we have rights against other people. And then the crucial move is to say that we also have the very same rights against ourselves. And that these rights, you can use them to derive a permission to keep your own kidney, to pinch or not pinch your arm, and so on. But yeah, the crucial weird core of my view is that you have the same rights against yourself that you do against anybody else. And so you can think about yourself like a relatively similar other.
Okay, so I guess you brought up a sort of interesting topic right here, rights against oneself. So, I mean, we generally don't think of rights as something that is antithetical against ourselves. I mean, that wouldn't be sort of a right. That would be more of an obligation towards other people. So, I mean, would you call this a right? I'm just kind of curious on what you mean by that.
No, you're not the only one. So when you hear the word right, you tend to think obligation. You have to hand it over, right? So if I have a right to $5 from you, you owe me $5, you better hand it over or else you do something seriously wrong. That's the natural way we think about rights. And so it seems totally absurd to say that I have a right against myself that I not take out my own kidney. Right? I mean, that sounds just completely bananas because it's not wrong for me to donate my kidney. It's supererogatory. It's a great thing to do.
Okay.
So I agree, however, I mean, I totally agree, right? I mean, one of the motivations for me is that you're allowed to give your kidney, you're allowed to keep it. But how is that compatible with saying that I have a right against myself that I not give it? Well, there, the key is self-consent, right? So I'm allowed to give my own kidney for the same reason why you're allowed to take it from me when I consent to you. And that reason is that rights are under voluntary control. The interesting thing about how you treat your own body, how you treat your own money, is that it's almost impossible psychologically to do stuff to yourself against your own will. Try it. Every time you do it, you'll find that mysteriously the patient of your actions is consented just in time. And that's why I think it's permissible to give your kidney.
Yeah, and I guess with respect to rights here and sort of self-consent and talking about the asymmetry, I mean, you talk about moral obligation and things like that, I guess, and we have a sort of moral obligation towards other people. So, I mean, how would you just answer the general question? I mean, okay, well, if we have this obligation, why do we even need to consent in the first place, right? I mean, do you have a sort of way of grounding that consent is a sort of threshold that we need to meet? This is generally like a question, I guess,
Yeah.
with maybe meta ethics or not.
I mean, consent is a really interesting, important concept because it shows that we are each kind of like moral legislators on a small scale. Rather than there being rules written into the sky about how we treat each other's bodies, which is a kind of old-fashioned view. Your body is the temple, not your own temple, someone else's temple, temple to God or whoever. The idea of consent lets us be the deciders about our own stuff and our own bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we all understand why consent is important in interpersonal relations, right? It's up to you whether I can, pinch your arm or ride your bike or whatever, as it should be. And then all I'm saying is that this mechanism can also help us understand how you relate to yourself. Now, why do we need this elaborate picture with a bunch of rights you have against yourself, and then, this mechanism of consent that makes them all conveniently disappear right before they would explode in your face? Well, think about it like this. There are certain choices about how you treat yourself where even you don't have absolute authority. So one kind of thing where this is traditionally been a big deal is self-harm, or choices that seriously affect, your future. Now, I find these issues very difficult to think about because I'm, torn like most people, thinking on the one hand, there's something morally very charged about a tragic suicide. But it seems weird to say that it's as if it's like murdering somebody else. It's not. I think what we're seeing are the limits of self-consent. Sometimes it's within the limits, end of life, nothing but misery to look forward to. Somebody decides to take a lethal injection of morphine or what have you. That seems within the limits of self-consent to me, permissible, totally fine. But if somebody is intoxicated and distraught and very emotional at a young age, for example, I think it's not really clear that even they should get to make this choice right now. And I feel much more comfortable with saying we should restrain this person. Maybe we shouldn't be blaming them because they have all these excusing factors, like they're distraught. But what they're doing is not just an innocent question of
Right.
how to treat their own. It's no longer morally completely neutral. So I think we see that the same factors that undermine interpersonal consent undermine our sense that you're absolute when it comes to what you do with your own body.
So you obviously have some sort of threshold then with respect to consent, that there are going to be certain types of instances of where it doesn't matter if a person's going to consent. We can basically willfully and forcefully try to change his or her mind on it, right? By doing something like that. And I take it, I had John here on Tuesday. Basically, he talked about Bernard Williams and ethics and the limits of philosophy. And this is sort of a question that also, I guess, interests me and maybe some of the audience members here. Is it you talked about some of the limits of philosophy? Do you think that there are any sort of limits to ethics, in your opinion, about what people can do in terms of persuasion? Because it doesn't seem, even if we could find some sort of symmetry between oneself and other, that this is going to really morally motivate other people to say donate a kidney, right? There aren't many people that would want to do that. Do you think that this is sort of one of the limits of ethics or the limits of philosophy?
I think so. So I think that when you're deciding what to do, you can guide yourself by ethical ideals, right? Think we all matter equally. Whose need is the greatest? What can I do that would best promote the collective good, et cetera, et cetera. So you can choose to do what's best, and you'll probably end up a supererogator, right? You'll end up going beyond the call of duty. But what if you just want to be minimally decent, right? So suppose someone they're not going to go murdering anybody. They're not going to go being, they're not going to go out and be racist. They want to be a decent person, but they want to keep their kidney. How do you respond to them? Well, you can try persuasion. You could try to say, look, you're one among many. We're all in it together. Yada, yada, yada. You could tell them stories about what it's like to go on dialysis. They're really brutal stories. It's not a pleasant experience. So, but then what if that doesn't work? What if they still say, no, I'm good. I want my kidney. I think that's a kind of limit to what philosophical persuasion in practice can do. And I think that their deliberation is in a way insulated from your attempts to get them to be more moral.
Right.
It's just their choice.
Right. Sort of non-cognitive reasons for, well, a sort of motivational story through a non-cognitive reasoning. It's not necessarily propositional attitudes that are going to be motivating them. It's going to be non-propositional attitudes that are going to be motivating them.
Well, what motivates them? I mean, it's hard to know exactly because it might be different in different cases. But they might find themselves motivated to keep their kidney.
Well, I mean, so right? if they were propositionally motivated, well, I don't know what your theory of motivation is and exactly how your ethics would work, but if it was propositional, right, then it would be presumably some sort of rational, one could give as an ethicist a sort of rational story of what one ought to follow, right? And presumably if this is a rational story, if there isn't an asymmetry between epistemic norms and ethical norms, then one ought to then follow that reason-giving propositional statement and then go through with it, if it is actually rationally, ethically persuasive. But
see, I totally accept that.
Yeah, so so there's a sort of disjunction then, right? The only reason that I would see the person not taking the ethical proposition into heart and then changing themselves, it would be for non-cognitive reasoning, right? That would be to say that they'd be doing it for certain types of emotional or dispositional reasons, certain types of, just as I said, non-cognitive reasons. Do you see that there's any sort of alternative there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that there could be an alternative. It could be that you're motivated by a good old propositional reason, like it would spare me pain. That's why I want to keep my kidney. But in fact, that reason might just be like worse or less important than the reason to donate.
Right. That would be it'd
be like a mistake.
Right. Okay.
But it's a mistake that you're allowed to make. You know what I mean? It's like on this view, if you follow me on this little journey, right? We all matter equally. Ideally, if you're enlightened, you'll go around giving your kidney and doing all these fantastic things, supposing they really are so fantastic. And if you do less, it's a kind of distortion of moral reality, but it's one that you're not accountable to other people for. It's not their business. And that's what I meant by it's a kind of limit to what philosophy can do, a limit to what ethics can do as far as intruding on your motivation.
I see. Okay. So let me go to the questions because we've had a few questions in the audience, right? So wouldn't you say that supererogatory events consist of an extreme minority of possible events that could be ethically evaluated? Was one of the questions that was asked to you.
Extreme minority. Well, so being like a dramatic hero is a rarity, for sure. There are not a lot of people that drastically live their lives for the service of others. And often when you read about these people, they seem to not think of themselves as supererogators, interestingly enough. People like Oskar Schindler, people who, fight against tyrannical governments and so on. But I think that supererogation is everywhere in daily life in a smaller scale. doing a favor for a friend, um, forgiving somebody, and repairing a relationship. Whenever there's something that people can't compel you to do, uh, that it's still your choice, but it's a better choice than something else you could have done. That's the realm of supererogation.
Okay, okay. So another question here is, except, and I guess this was in relation to when we were talking about the kidney donations, except donating a kidney is not necessarily symmetrical, since it could leave you prone to debt, pain, and mobility issues with the recipient might not experience at all or in an equal measure, meaning that the donation could cause an imbalance, deficiency, asymmetry of consequences. Now, that's actually a pretty good question. I mean,
Oh,
something
that's
that
a
I
great
didn't think
question.
of it.
Yeah. So I was thinking in terms of, well, there's two ways to think about it. One could be focus on a simple case where somehow or other you know in advance that the consequences are going to be relatively benign for you and really, really amazing for them if you donate. But that's a bit of an unrealistic case. You never really know. So another way to think about the case is to just think about it in terms of expected benefits. So what's the value of donating the kidney for them weighted by the risks, and value for you weighted by the risks? And I think that it's overwhelmingly likely that if you donate a kidney, you'll be fine. And overwhelmingly likely that they will be much better off. So it might turn out that you get unlucky and they get really lucky. But, let me put it this way. If you could either be a kidney donor or someone who, so let me put it this way. Like, how much would you be willing to pay to avoid kidney donation? It might be not that much, because the actual risks they're real, but they're not the same as, say, I don't know, something really, really dangerous, or having like a disease that could potentially kill you. It's a every surgery is risky, but the risk is not absolute.
Okay. The next question is, what if a kidney donation is not an okay, what if a kidney donation is not inherently moral? I'm guessing there's a sort of straightforward answer to that in terms of, well, we wouldn't do it if it isn't inherently moral. I guess the question is, maybe are there, a better question might be, are there instances of a kidney donation not being inherently moral?
Yeah, this is something that,
Uh-oh. Are you still there, Daniel?
famous for coining the trolley problem.
Oh, you cut off just for a little bit, Daniel. Can you
Oh,
begin?
sorry. So Judith Jarvis Thompson, who coined the trolley problem, has, in a paper called Turning the Trolley, asks whether it's really moral to save 5 lives by sacrificing yourself. Right? So the runaway trolley headed towards 5 people. The only way to save them is to throw yourself in front of the trolley onto the tracks. If you ask random moral philosophers what they think about this, overwhelmingly everyone's going to say, oh yeah, fine, good, heroic, supererogatory. Thompson says, why would you do that? I mean, it's different if the 5 are your kids or your friends or something, but if it's just 5 strangers, Thompson says, this shows a weird lack of regard for your own life. That's a very interesting way to think about it. I don't know that I agree, but I think that might be the kind of perspective that the question comes from, right? So if you're willing to make this kind of sacrifice for a stranger, is that kind of puzzling? That's kind of like throwing yourself in front of the trolley to save the 5 strangers' lives. It's too far beyond the call of duty. So could some cases of kidney donation be like that? If you were a really high risk donor, right? So you have some kind of blood disorder, surgery is very risky for you. I think it could be crossing the line. Maybe you should have more regard for yourself. But I think in most cases, like you were saying, in most cases, it's the risk to you is far outweighed by the potential benefits to them. So I think that usually it's moral. And I don't share Thompson's intuition about the trolley case as it would apply in the kidney case. I think most people would agree that kidney donation is not a sign of, lack of respect for yourself.
So we got one more question on here. Well, we got several questions. So do you think the requisite of self-consent over your own person extends to your property and labor as an extension of yourself, a la John Locke? So, I don't know how much that's going to relate, or if you have any sort of opinion about that, Daniel.
Oh, absolutely do. Yes. So I think that intuitive common sense morality says that you do have rights over your stuff. It feels like a real violation. I mean, if you've ever had your, apartment broken into or your bike stolen, it sucks, and it doesn't just feel like the same as not getting a bike. It feels like a violation when someone, infringes on your property rights. But on the other hand, whether certain rights are valid when it comes to property seems like it's a political issue partly. Some political philosophers argue that countries don't have the same rights over their land that you might intuitively think because they were acquired by force or genocide. Some people think that property rights over, say, your private holdings or your land or whatever, similarly, you don't have an entitlement to them because if you trace it back, at some point you just get pure plunder. How much does this matter for ethics? I think it matters a lot. I think that you have no prerogative to keep your stuff just because it's good for you to have it. I think you only have a prerogative to keep your stuff if it's yours by right. Because again, I think if you want to know how much you're entitled to keep your stuff, think about how much you're entitled to prevent someone from taking it from you. Self-other symmetry. So for me, the question of whether you get to keep your stuff is going to be political, and it's going to extend to property if that's how the political philosophy shakes out. For Scheffler and Parfit, it is psychological, not political. They think that because we are naturally predisposed to think of our interests as more strong than other people's interests, we have a prerogative to keep our kidneys and keep our stuff. I think that is not the way that it really works. It is about rights, not about interests. And so that's why I take the property question quite differently than they do.
Okay. So the next question is, well, this is, I guess, a statement. I suspect that most kidney donors surrender an organ is because there has been an appeal to pathos and not logos. I'm not really sure if that's quite correct. At least itself, it seems as though ethics generally is a sort of obligation that comes first and then followed by a sort of emotional disposition that feels good upon doing the good. Would you have a slightly different perspective to that, Daniel?
There are interesting stories about people reading moral philosophy for the first time and being moved to, do what I would think of as supererogation. So Peter Singer, the utilitarian philosopher, has an argument that you have to donate lots and lots and lots to the distant needy by analogy with, suppose there's a child drowning in a shallow pond before you. Do you have to get your shoes wet to go save the child? We all think yes. And so Singer says, well, clearly you think that small costs to you are outweighed by big benefits to them. And some students read his arguments and they say, okay, kidney time. So that's logos, which is fascinating. Actually, one of my friends is a kidney donor for quite rational, logical reasons. Pathos, though, I think also plays a role. We were talking about the limits of rational persuasion earlier. Sometimes what moves us to help others is making the need of the other vivid, the way that our own needs are typically vivid to us. So stories or seeing something firsthand or getting a taste of their medicine. That kind of stuff has an effect that often will outstrip what we can reason ourselves towards.
Okay, so another question. There is a possibility that potential donators recognize that there exists different calculation that makes the group better off if he keeps the kidney. I guess that's a statement, more of a statement. What
Well,
care?
I,
Yeah, go ahead.
do you mind if I riff on this just for a quick moment?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so some consequentialists who think that you have to always do what promotes the good actually believe that sometimes you're allowed to favor yourself and favor your loved ones. So Frank Jackson is an interesting example of this. He thinks, you know, he's a basically utilitarian. He thinks you have to always do what satisfies utility overall. But he also thinks that risks are important and that it's much riskier trying to help the distant needy as opposed to helping those near and dear. So kidney donation might be a special case where even Frank would think you have to give, and you're just kind of immoral for not giving. But you have to donate all of your money all the time, constantly, to the point where you're basically in poverty. Frank thinks no, because you could probably do more good by focusing on helping those nearby, and including yourself, because you have a better idea of how to help yourself than you do of how to help the distant needy.
That is an interesting. I never actually thought about that, Daniel. That's a pretty good point. A lot of people bring up the point that empathy, sense sympathy, is generally tailored towards immediate, well, not even sort of immediate, but localized, has a sort of localized attention. In the sense that most people aren't going to be celebrities or huge politicians, right? They're going to be in a sort of local area and only have a sort of empathy regarded to that local area. So ethical obligation is generally going to be antithetical towards that type of relationship, because, well, they're going to care more about their family and immediate friends than they are going to be about people, in Africa or China or South America or something like that. But then you offered a pretty good, kind of a good perspective, is that, well, we should and ought to donate, according to people, someone like Parfit, but not to at a crazy extent, because again, there are going to be people that are closer that would value at least, you being in good, healthy ties, and you're able to, have a good local kind of friendship with them, and being able to actually take care of them, and if anything goes wrong.
That's right.
Would this then as well, like, let's say that I have, a considerable amount of money, like a moderate amount, but still fairly considerate. If I donate, however, a moderate amount, I might not have enough money to secure myself in terms of my retirement, or say if I have medical expenses that might come up in the future that would inhibit me from getting a certain type of surgery. What about in those types of fuzzy cases, or those sort of blurry cases where I don't have a ridiculous amount of money to donate, but I do definitely have some, and I have and I feel like a sort of moral obligation, but if I do, I might put myself in jeopardy later in. I mean, what about those types of scenarios, and what would you say there?
Totally fascinating kind of scenario, and very much close to home. Just like Schelling says it's hard to think about the minor case, I find it kind of hard to think about the case where I have sort of to choose risks that I face versus benefits to others. So think about it, instead of flipping it from other to self like Schelling does, let's flip it from self to other. Suppose someone that you care about comes up to you and asks what they should do with their money. They say, I would really like to help these people in need. So for example, perhaps donating to a charity that helps blind people in Africa. So you can donate, it's surprisingly not that much money to help give someone treatment for glaucoma and really change their life. They say, I'd like to donate to this, but I don't really have any savings. I could Well, when they tell you this, I think it's natural to start asking questions like, well, what if there's something happens to you? Are you going to be okay if this happens? What about your bills and so on? Well, if you're going to do that, maybe you need to change your lifestyle. And for some reason, I find it much easier to think through this third personally. And I am not so automatically inclined to say, give, 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 everything must go. But at the same time, if someone says, look, I know that there's a certain amount of risk, but I'm comfortable with this amount of risk because I know that they really need the help, then I wouldn't advise against helping. As long as someone understands what they're exposing themselves to, informed consent, informed self-consent in this case, as soon as that becomes a thing, I start to feel more comfortable with them giving more. But here we're getting to this question of like how to live, right? Should you be trying to understand sacrifices, know how to give money effectively, and live your life like that? I think that's a kind of ideal. But for those of us who are falling short of the ideal, give, 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 everything must go, by itself, I don't think is the right advice in every case.
Okay. So the next question is, what characterizes possible limits to supererogation? If we class irrational behavior as one possible exception, is the validity of self-consent propositional? I'm not sure if I quite understand that one, do you?
The last part about propositional, I wasn't exactly sure about, but I think that the question's a very fine one. So what are the limits of supererogation? Well, think about varying the cost to benefit ratio. So should I take a paper cut to save someone else's life? But I think, yes, you don't really have a choice. That is, obviously you should do it. That's like Singer's, child drowning in the shallow pond. You have to do it. Now let's say, should I give up my arms? I'm going to get seriously injured to save someone's life. There, it's not so obvious that I have to do it. I would say you don't have to do it, but it'd be supererogatory. Now, suppose we go all the way to the other side. Should I give my life to save someone else from a paper cut? There, I think that's morally wrong. That is very serious wrong. And you're wronging yourself. Why is it wrong? Don't you consent to it, right? Well, think about how you would respond if someone asked you to help them with their paper cut avoidance scheme, right? Suppose I said, like, I'm going to give up my life to save someone from a paper cut. Marty, you do the honors, and I hand you a knife. You clearly shouldn't oblige me, and it'd be very wrong if you did. That suggests that there's limits to what I can consent to, and that would be a limit to supererogation.
That's a fairly decent question. Fairly decent answer. We don't want to do too much, because then it gets then we sort of break out from the equilibrium that we talked about between myself and others, right? And I guess this gets into obligation to oneself. So do you have any sort of opinions or sort of justified true beliefs that you have within that area?
Yeah, so I think that the notion of an obligation to oneself has been seen as deeply mysterious ever since Aristotle. Aristotle says you can never suffer injustice willingly, so you can't wrong yourself, basically. Kant says that it's not possible for the person obligating and the person under an obligation to be one and the same. Hobbes says the person who makes the law can't be subject to the law because he could just change it at will. And if you can wiggle out of an obligation, it doesn't really bind you. So I myself have a very different perspective. I don't think that there's anything puzzling or paradoxical really about a duty to yourself. I just think that the duties to yourself are a bit elusive because if you tried to violate them, you would thereby be deciding to do something, and that would amount to giving yourself consent, right? So if I pinch you out of the blue, I infringe one of your rights, your body rights. That's wrong. I wrong you. When I pinch myself, I don't wrong myself. But I don't think that's because there's an obligation to you, but no obligation to myself. I think it's because when I pinch myself, I am relevantly like a consenting other. It's akin to the case where you ask me to pinch you and I oblige. So I believe that you have the same obligations to yourself that you have to anybody else, relevantly similar, but that they tend not to be so restrictive, because the very decision to infringe also amounts to an authorization. You know, you're not an unwilling victim of your own acts.
You're not an unwilling victim of your own actions. But but there does seem to be some examples, I think, of where one might think that or one maybe does sort of consent to oneself, but is doing a harm to oneself at the same time, right? And isn't falling under obligation, because we can create a sort of divide between, say, choices that are first order based on first order beliefs, and ones that, say, might be based on second order beliefs. So just to sort of give you an example, right? One could dispositionally be a smoker and be driven to smoke. I always offer this example on the stream. And then when they find themselves, when they find a sort of cigarette, right, they have an urge to smoke it, and under some cases they do. That particular cigarette might dispose them to it. And depending on how you line up your meta-ethics and your epistemology, and how your theories of rationality also line up, you'll have slightly different answers to this. But what I think happens in the dispositional case, with the smoke, like with the smoker trying to have the cigarette, is that it's not as if, though, they don't consent to smoking the cigarette. It's that they're doing a sort of disservice to them by willing to participate in a sort of first order belief, in that they know that the cigarette is going to bring them a certain type of pleasure, and then they pick it up and smoke it, instead of sliding that first order belief to the second order belief of how that cigarette relates to universal cases, of certain propositional universal cases about the cigarette, namely that it disposes one towards cancer and an ill health, all these other things. And they don't forego that reflection right at that moment. They're merely tied towards a certain type of habit, if you will. But they're still consenting to it. They're just not reflecting upon it. Does this consent, right? Does this consent not do a disservice to oneself, a sort of obligation to oneself, that is not necessarily asymmetrical, but is more than just the consent to oneself? It seems as though if we do reflect, we're doing more than just valuing consent at that point. We're actually valuing the life and sort of health of that person. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Okay.
If you don't, on reflection, endorse a decision that you make, you're not acting autonomously, right? You're not, in some sense, you're not really under your own control. And we have addiction is a classic case of non-autonomous motivation. You know, you can't help yourself. And there's different ways to think about the psychology of addiction, but almost every way of thinking about it, it ends up undermining consent. The smoking case is interesting because there's two possible ways it could undermine consent. One is that the harm to yourself is so great that even if you consent, it's still a wrong. You know, that's like the paper cut case where you take your own life to save someone from a paper cut. Now, a more plausible way to think of the cigarette case is that although in principle you could consent to the harm, in practice your consent isn't valid because it's not autonomous.
Okay, and autonomy for you, an autonomy for you is going to be in relation to a sort of self-reflection, or knowing what one is doing, acknowledging of what one is doing. Do you think?
Yeah, like you were saying, second order.
Right.
You know,
one might
on
say
the one
that
hand,
one might say that in first order accounts, however, one is still sort of self-aware of oneself. They're just not reflecting about the status of the cigarette in its universal form, only in the particular form. And by universal, I just mean bringing it up into a sort of, to use a Salarzian term, the logical space of reasons. So it's a sort of web of normativity of how the cigarette relates to, say, certain types of medical norms, say, causing cancer, having a sort of dispositional tendency towards cancer. So maybe in the first order case, they're still aware of the I and the self, and how the cigarette's going to be disposed to be, but not in any sort of complex way. Or would you just all entirely sort of say that in this first order state that they're not even a sort of self-conscious and autonomous agent? Because I could also buy it.
Yeah.
I could buy into that. I'm saying, should we have a level of skepticism towards that type of position, or is that something you just kind of take for granted?
Skepticism towards the position that you're non-autonomous when you smoke.
Right.
I just want to make sure. Yeah. So I think we have to be careful, right? We should be a little bit skeptical because some people know damn well what they're doing. Some people just like gambling. Some people just like their vices. But addiction is different. And if someone really is addicted, then I think in some ways they are not rationally responding to things the way that normal autonomous agents are. Now, how does that undermine responsibility? Complicated question. Sometimes it's too hard to know case by case, so it's safer just to assume the worst. But with cigarettes, how's one to say it? I think that we know it's a very addictive substance, and we know that you are doing something to yourself that you might not be able to really endorse. But then how to stop you might not necessarily be to throw the moral book, right?
Yeah, because
sometimes
if
feelings of guilt just make it worse.
Sure, I guess this goes on to a sort of interesting question that sort of perplexes me. If the person doesn't, if we're saying that addiction is not an area in which the person is an autonomous agent, if they're not leaping into smoking because of rational reasons, then they're presumably also not going to exit because of rational reasons. But also, you seem to be saying that they're not consenting towards smoking. And if they're not consenting to smoking, why should we allow them to continue with that type of behavior, I guess? What doesn't permit us from, slapping it out of their wrist or something like that, if none of that is autonomous?
That's such a good question. I mean, why isn't it stealing to sell somebody cigarettes? You know what I mean? If they're not autonomous in their decision to buy, did they really consent to the transaction?
Right.
I mean, it seems ridiculous to say that you should slap the money out of the hands of the guy at the convenience store who sells the cigarettes. So I mean, I think that's because consent is not an on-off thing. Quality of consent does come in degrees, and depending on how important the transaction is, we raise the bar or lower the bar for what counts as good enough consent. So in some cases, I think it's very clear that people aren't acting autonomous. If someone's been drugged, if someone has been, if someone has a serious psychological condition, young children, we're very comfortable with having certain limits on when we take decisions seriously as autonomous. But then, obviously, these things come in degrees too, because someone might be smoking. They know what they're doing. They might even want it. They might wish they didn't want it. But we shouldn't be so quick to say, aha, a little bit of non-autonomy, slap it out of their hands and so on. Not only could this distort the fact that they had some kind of consent, but it could also just be counterproductive.
But
no one likes getting their hands slapped.
Yeah, well, sure. There's a Well, actually, I'll forego this question for now since we have
No,
a few
no
more
worries.
questions. A few more questions
But
in the chat.
wait, can I say one last sentence? I realized
Yeah,
Schelling
yeah, yeah.
likes to say, sometimes you should slap your own hand. One of his examples of like how we exert self-control is doing stuff that you might do to a friend, like flushing cigarettes down the toilet. He thinks you're in effect, you know, slapping it out of your future self's hand.
Right, right. I mean, there's definitely something to that if we think that there's a sort of dispositional force that's going to outweigh our moral responsibility in the future, and we have, you know, the current possibility, a sort of cool and reflective attitude about it right now to prevent ourselves in the future. Why not go ahead and do that, right? I mean,
Exactly.
there's many,
Who's the real you? Who should get to make the choice?
I mean,
The
yeah,
the cool you now, or the future addict?
this sort of reminds me when I was reading Hegel. Actually, I know I'm not sure if you're a huge fan of Hegel or not, but I was thinking about aesthetic
I'm not a
judgments.
hater.
so there's a there's an interesting scenario. I'm not sure how familiar you are with his aesthetics, but he basically thinks that the ultimate end of aesthetics is actually to teach morality, and he thinks that there's a sort of sense of where aesthetics and confrontation with the beautiful in aesthetics. Say when we're viewing a film, a very nice, beautiful film, or a very nice, beautiful painting of some sort. Let's say if it's about war, or if it's about famine, or if it's about anything, can sort of depict a moral narrative, right? A moral story. And the great thing about this work of a work of aesthetics, is that we're not embodied in this sort of situation as we were if we were actually in a famine or actually in a war, right? We can sort of coolly reflect upon the work of art and see it's the sort of narrative that it is, and then sort of create maxioms or principles, if you will, based upon what we see, like say a work of art in war, and then know that war is something that should be inhibited, something that should be sort of gotten rid of. And in this sense, aesthetics can help us in that direction, which I also founded from what you were saying earlier, is that you can sort of make choices earlier in, right, when you're in a sort of cool and reflective state, to inhibit yourself later on if you think that there's a sort of dispositional tendency that you might not be able to act in a reasonable and rational way. And here I think there's a sort of disjunction, right, a sort of at least somewhat of a disjunction between one's passions and one's or dispositions as well, and one's ability to rationally think about ethical norms and what they ought to do.
And that's a totally fascinating connection, Marty. I think you're. I mean, I think that's right. That like you make more autonomous decisions when you have some sense of your situation, and if it's somehow familiar, you know what I mean? Like if you're like, I've been here before, I know how I feel about these situations. How do you get a sense in advance of the situation? I mean, there's not really any way besides imagination. What's the best imagination fuel? Fiction.
Right. Did you want to continue?
No, that was it.
Oh, okay. Well.
I just liked your point. What can I say?
Yes. Daniel over here is a very nice guy, ladies and gentlemen. A very nice guy. We've met a number of times right now. His patience is beyond mine, and his humility probably beyond mine. I remember the first time we had a conversation about philosophy. I kind of I'm still a little bit embarrassed about that, actually, Daniel. It was
what? No.
Yeah, it was. We had a conversation about idealism, and you took a Morian position on that, I believe, a while back ago. So I've long changed my mind on that stance, but I think there's more to idealism, at least German idealism, than I understood at that point, and that I think also more understood anytime in his life. I don't think his arguments really succeed, but I think they do maybe succeed against like a Berkeleyan form of idealism. Anyways, let's go to some more questions. So I think this one might be from Eric. How much of this stuff about how I relate to myself and my desires hangs on a linguistic issue, It's hard talking about myself without referring to myself in third person. Are we dealing with separate people because we don't quite know how to meaningfully craft an account where I'm not referring to an external agent? Question mark.
At the beginning of Locke's essay, he says that it's very hard to get a sense of yourself. You know, we find it pretty, you can just look at other people. If you want to look at yourself, you have to craft an artifice, right? You need a mirror. I mean, in general, it's quite difficult to see yourself through your own eyes. Now, what does that mean? Well, it just means that sometimes you have to do a little extra work, imagination, you know, comparing cases of how you treat another person who's relevantly similar. But, you know, this is the other side of the problem of not being able to understand the other, right? Sometimes we are callous, we are ignorant, we dismiss other people's troubles because we don't vividly imagine them and experience them the way that we do our own. I see these as parallel deficits. They can only be overcome through a kind of constant back and forth between imaginative positions. You know, imagine yourself through the eyes of another, you know, looking in the mirror, imagining the other from the inside by empathizing and imagining, you know, yourself in their shoes. So is there a merely linguistic issue here? I don't think so. Is there a second person to whom you're relating when you think about yourself? I don't think that either. You know, you can pinch yourself. That's one person doing the pinching, one person being pinched, the very same. But to really understand anybody, I think you have to see them through both the first and third personal points of view, and each makes up for the other's deficits.
In a sense as well, I mean, viewing someone from the first person point of view, right? Viewing them as a sort of subject means also recognizing them as a not just a means to an end or an object for one's own sort of benefit, but as an autonomous source of their own decisions and choices, a person that also is going to sort of function through a means-ends relationship. And unless one can do that, one that can conceive of that in such a way, right, then one can't really grant the full range of moral. One can't sort of value that other person as in the full scope of how one ought to in ethics, right?
Totally. I mean, this comes back to the nature of rights. You know, when you see other people as having rights, you're not just seeing them any longer as contraptions, or you're not even seeing them as, you know, beings that have pleasure and can be in states that are good. You're seeing them as local moral legislators, right? Like they are making choices that directly bind you.
Right, exactly.
When they say, you know, you can't touch me, or they say, here you go. There's just no way to properly understand that without seeing yourself as kind of morally entwined with them. I mean, Kant thought of this in something very original and ahead of its time in the Metaphysics of Morals, not the groundwork, but the Metaphysics of Morals. He says we can change the scheme of rights, transferring rights, creating rights, and so on, by pooling our wills, by uniting our wills. This is such a fascinating idea that, like, I think has only recently been picked back up. You know, what the idea is that when you and I consent to something, so, you know, we consent to a deal, I give you $5, you give me the book. What makes that morally valid, morally binding, is that we are deciding jointly. You can't decide jointly with a contraption. You can't decide jointly with some dumb chunk of earth. What's the difference? I mean, as you're saying, you're in the space of reasons with somebody who's in themselves, somebody who is not just raw matter for moral theories to work on, but someone who is out there making moral small-scale law by affecting rights with you.
Yeah, that reminds me, I don't know if you've read Kant's Political Writings, Theory and Practice. He actually defines right in a very interesting way. We generally think of it as sort of something individualistic, but then you mentioned its sort of collective notion. So he defines right, and this is verbatim, right is the restriction, actually, of each individual's freedom. not necessarily a positive affirmation, but a restriction of each individual's freedom so that it harmonizes with the freedom of everyone else, insofar as this is possible within the terms of general law. And a public right is the distinctive quality of the external laws which make the constant harmony possible. And so there's a sort of sense of right where we have to think of ourselves as not just autonomous agents of where we have these sets of rights that we can, that we just hold, that we just have over and above others, but one that has to be in accordance with other people's desires, wishes, and expectations as well. And only then, with that type of harmony being possible, are rights possible, right? We can't just have a sort of a community as if everyone had a sort of separate set of rights of where we're all kind of individualized and not interactive. They have to be particularly interactive, and in virtue of their being particularly interactive, they're also restrictive in some sense.
Yes. So the idea of Recht, as the Germans say, like the idea of right. Though I'm not very familiar with Kant's political writings, but I know the moral side. It's so important.
They're very similar.
Yeah. Okay. Good. But this idea of Recht, this idea of rights, is the pointy stick of moral philosophy, right? When you violate a right or you do something wrong, you are not just making a decision that's your own business. You open yourself up to certain sanctions.
Exactly.
People will blame you. You've crossed the line. You're open to certain kinds of criticism that you weren't before. And other people might even be able to compel you to do otherwise. So this, to me, is a super fascinating point because it really gets to the heart of supererogation. The person who doesn't supererogate, who merely does the moral minimum, they are somebody who does not violate rights. They're somebody who does not do wrong, but they just don't do as well as they could. Now, what the very existence of this category, to get back to what you were saying, shows that what our moral system is really about is keeping harmony, keeping the peace, getting people to do some amount to contribute to the collective good without being unrealistic. If you ask everybody to donate their kidneys all the time, and you try to stick them with the pointy end of moral philosophy every time they do something less than optimal, pretty soon the stick will be blunted, and people aren't going to take you seriously because it's way too demanding. So you can see the idea of rights and of moral requirement as like it's trying to use force to get people to do what we need to get along without being completely unrealistic and demanding that people, all be Oscar Schindler every day.
So we got, I guess we're going into some ontological questions about the status of the world being deterministic and indeterministic right now with some of these other questions. I particularly sort of disagree where we're with some of these questions coming about, but nonetheless, interesting and something that we can give maybe your opinion on. I don't mean too many incompatibilists, and I don't think you're one. So here's the next question: in a deterministic framework, does consent still have non-contingent value? If so, does consent add to the causal chain it originates from? ?
Oh, yeah, great question. People sometimes try to argue from determinism, or maybe just more generally from the idea that your decision had a prior cause, to you can't blame me. They just try to avoid moral responsibility. So, what are some examples? People have argued in court successfully that, I had too much junk food. Have you heard about this, the junk food defense? So the guy who shot Harvey Milk argued successfully in court that he should be held fully responsible because the blood sugar, from having all this junk food affected his mood and so on. And people have argued all kinds of things like this. I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing, or I had a tough childhood, and this really caused my actions. It wasn't me. And Once you get into that frame of mind, you can start to think that consent too can be undermined by prior causes. I only consented to this because, um, I was raised this way or whatever it might be. Now, or to give a more poignant example, some people point to material poverty as a cause of consent to show that certain kinds of consents will be undermined. So they might say sex work is not autonomously chosen, and people don't really consent to it because they're only put under economic pressure, or because they're brainwashed by ideology or what have you. So sex work isn't morally legitimate. So what do I say about this stuff? I think that it's so hard to do any kind of ethics or politics without a notion of consent. If consent is always undermined, say because you can always point to some prior factor that really caused your decisions, then we're all screwed. Like consent is so important because without it, we can't make moral laws on the fly. We can't, make decisions about what will happen to our own bodies on the fly. So I just think that whatever we're doing when we have public morality or politics, there has to be consent or it all falls apart. Now, does it in fact fall apart? That's the big question of free will and moral responsibility. I find it very puzzling to know exactly what to say about this, but I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with just saying, yeah, but it seems like we have free will. It seems like consent is valid, so it must be. I really do feel like we're to some extent hostage to the metaphysical question of determinism and free will. But I am sort of hoping that the ethical questions are autonomous enough to be explored fruitfully in isolation.
There definitely might be some sort of gray area of where we're trying to find out whether or not we're acting autonomously and agentically instead of not agentically. But there does seem to be, some non-gray area as well. I mean, it seems as though that when we're not acting merely in accordance with our desires and we're acting in accordance with reasons, right? That is in accordance with certain types of acts of reflective agency, given that we don't have certain types of lesions or certain types of things that might mess with our rational faculties. That we can create a disjunction between certain types of actions that are acting only in accordance with dispositional reasons and the ones that are acting in accordance with good ethical norms and principles of such.
Yeah, you just saved me, Marty. No, I should have said something like that. Even if there's no free will in some extreme sense of being outside the causal order of the world, it's still true that when you act with someone else's consent, there'll be a big psychological difference than acting against their will.
See, this is the interesting. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Just to say, they might prefer that you do what you're doing to them, or at least, some part of their mind has gotten on the same page as you. And even if we think that free will plays part of the story, clearly, no matter what you think about free will, you're going to think there's a difference between consensual and non-consensual transactions.
I'm personally fairly comfortable with creating a sort of large disjunction between these two categories that I just laid out. Even when we're going from the first set of beliefs that we sort of create or sort of self-legislate upon ourselves, always seem to be of a sort of different nature from those that aren't reflective, aren't necessarily based upon some sort of ethical principles that we find within ourselves. So what I mean by that is that when we're trying to find and answer these questions of, well, where do our ethical norms come from, right? They seem to be all, in a sense, contingent and conditioned. And one would then try to create a sort of causal story for how one came about these sort of beliefs that we have. eventually we're going to have to find some sort of unconditioned ground. And I had this conversation with John yesterday, and that seems to imply that a sort of unconditioned ground can come from, well, just the basis, a sort of internal basis of human rationality, a sort of practical reason of where there might be certain types of unconditional values, certain types of unconditional moral principles that we act in accordance with once we have and acquire practical reason or have a good sense of moral reasoning. We sort of tapper into this sort of faculty, cognitive faculty. So the regress does sort of end for me in the sense that if we do act rationally as human agents ought to, then they're going to act within this first sort of unconditional principle, which is going to later on then develop from these contingent state of affairs, and then sort of have a sort of harmony or synthesis, if you will. That's at least, I think, a sort of Kantian way of bypassing this sort of issue of determinism, because generally when we have these issues of determinism, we're going to have all these sorts of contingent state of affairs. We're going to get into the, I forgot what the, maybe you remember the name. We're going to get into that argument that, he's a guy that studies free will quite a bit in analytic philosophy.
Van Wagen?
Yeah, Van Wagen's, consequentialist
argument.
Yeah,
the consequence argument.
Yeah, so this, I think, is one kind of good way of getting around the consequence argument, because otherwise you're kind of screwed. You're always going to see this infinite regress of causal explanations that sort of precede any sort of self-determination.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. How much would determinism undercut ethics? I think there's some parts that are pretty insulated, even if you don't do the move you just did, like axiology, study of what's good. I think for the most part, there's lots of stuff that could be just unconditionally, intrinsically good, without, whatever happens with the free will question. Like pain and pleasure are bad and good. Knowledge is good. Error sucks. Beauty perhaps is good.
I'm not inclined.
You know what I mean? But then once you get to stuff like rights, I think that stuff starts to be a little bit more hostage because it relies on volition so much.
Right.
Rights seem to be the product of joint decisions. And once you get into the idea that determinism can undercut the validity of decisions, you start to wonder, well, hang on, how is it that anyone gets to have rights in the first place? How is it that rights could be a thing?
I have a hard time I have a hard time being convinced by the idea of pain and pleasure being inherently, or having a sort of categorical strength to them as being inherently good and the other being as inherently bad. There's definitely a lot of sort of there's a lot of examples that would point to that being incorrect, wouldn't you say?
I think there are cases of pleasure that aren't intrinsically good. So sadistic pleasure, I don't think it's intrinsically good.
We could consider, like the pleasure machine. Just I forgot. The
Nozick's experience machine. Actually, I have the book right here. So Nozick's experience machine.
Right.
You step into it, and it deceives you into thinking that you're living this fantastic life, and you're an Instagram star, and you have these great experiences as of eating gourmet food every day, so on. But your body's in a machine being stimulated by electrodes.
Yeah, there's a sense of where I think deception and illusion of that sort is maybe, if not intrinsically bad, it certainly seems bad, right? Being in a sort of matrix scenario. Right.
I agree. I don't think that it's good to hook yourself up to the experience machine. I mean, it's better than hooking yourself up to the bad experience machine. Not only are you being deceived, but every day you have the experience as of eating garbage food and, being, made fun of all the time. And, oh my God, I don't want to say too much because then people will know what my personal hell would be like. But, basically having the subjective experience as of personal hell, that would be a worse experience than the good illusion. So I mean, I think pleasure has. I don't want to say that all pleasure is unconditionally intrinsically good, or that it's the only good. I just mean to say that I don't think that everything that's good is just good because we think it is, or that everything that's good somehow gets traced back to the goodness of us, rational beings. Some
Right.
states of mind can be good in themselves.
But here I would, and not here, but I guess 30 seconds ago, I mean by here, I do definitely agree with the idea of there being some categorical imperatives, and in virtue of those being a sort of moral necessity. Um, there does seem to there does seem to be a need for at least some of those within our ethical framework, within our moral framework. But so this is one of the conversations that people really like. We had a conversation. I had a conversation with John in my previous episode, in the idea of needing at least one categorical norm to ground one's hypothetical norms or instrumental norms. Would you also sort of agree with this idea that we can't just have hypothetical norms all the way down, because modally these are all sort of contingent and reliant upon some sort
Right.
of need for explanation, and they're in need of grounding, and presumably they're going to be needed. They're going to be needed. They need to be grounded into some sort of unconditional principle, some sort of presumably categorical norm, and they can't be other hypothetical norms, because then we'd have to choose. Then we'd have to decide, well, why am I choosing this hypothetical norm over that hypothetical norm, right? You can't just push the question away by, an infinite regress. Is
Yeah,
that something that you're sort of empathetic to, or do you think that it gets into sort of issues fairly quickly?
I agree that if nothing ultimately matters, nothing matters, period. There has to be some stuff that matters in itself. Now, does it have to be something that matters unconditionally? That is to say, no matter what. I mean, not necessarily. I think pleasure matters conditional on it not being sadistic. But then you can say that, well, what about non-sadistic pleasure? Doesn't that matter ultimately? And yeah, I think you'll always be able to. Whenever something matters, you'll be able to trace it back to something that matters in itself. But I'm not. I suppose I don't see this as some motivation to look like internally. Think, well, we need something like the goodwill, which Kant says is unconditionally. We need something that we can't conceivably think of as bad, or something like that. No, I mean, if you want to know what the ultimate goods are, just look around you. Pleasure, knowledge, beauty, maybe even achievement. I think there's a bunch of good stuff everywhere, and I agree that some of these things matter not just because we like them, they're not just because we think they matter. But yeah, I suppose there's no push to look for one ultimate ground, but there has to be some ultimate grounds, potentially plural.
Well, the unconditional grounds can have can be can have a sort of multiplicity about them, right? So it could
Yeah,
be
like
that,
More thought there were multiple
right.
goods,
The,
not just pleasure.
but but the problem that I see, I guess, and this is also another conversation that I had with John. If one does not find them within oneself, then they're going to be within the external world of some sort. They're going to be certain, and I'm sympathetic, of course, to moral robust realism. There are going to be certain types of moral properties out in the world, of which might have certain types of unconditional weight. But unless one, but then the problem is, one problem that Schaefer brings up, and I don't have a propositional syllogism right here, is that it's eventually those principles have to be observed by a rational agent who has certain types of dispositional tendencies, a certain type of attitude. So even if it was a certain type of unconditional principle, something that's very valuable, we're still going to have a certain type of sensitivity or a certain type of attitude to adopt that. And that sort of relativizes ethics really quickly. So there has to be
it would relativize everything.
Right, so there has to be...
There's lots of shapes out in the world, but we would never notice them unless we were sensitive to things, shapes. Does that show that shape is subjective? I don't think so. Similarly, there could be lots of ethical truths out there. Pain is bad. And if we weren't properly wired up, we wouldn't be sensitive to these facts. Does that show that the facts are subjective? No, it just shows that appreciating them is subjective matter, because it's a matter of a subject getting it right. I'm taking kind of a hard line on this, but yeah, that's probably how I would respond.
So well, repeat that a little bit for me, so I if I can understand you fairly clearly on that issue.
Yeah, I rushed through it. So let me give you an example of like a psychopath.
Mm-hmm.
So a psychopath, let's say, just doesn't understand why it's so wrong to kill other people. They're not sensitive to that fact. Does the existence of this character show that the wrongness of killing others is somehow subjective, that it somehow depends on whether we appreciate it? Well, not so fast. It could just be that there is a moral fact out there, killing sucks, it's wrong, and someone is unable to appreciate it. Just like, people, some animals aren't able to appreciate mathematical. The very existence of someone unable to be sensitive doesn't show that the thing that they're not sensitive to is subjective.
Yeah, it's not so much that I'm denying the idea that there couldn't be at least a possibility of there being some sort of objective moral fact out there. The problem that I'm describing right here is a sort of common objection that even if there were moral properties, it still doesn't matter because of these following reasons. And I'm going to offer the sort of the syllogism right here. I can give it to you on text. This was on Schaefer Lundu's book, and haven't gotten to the end. I know you actually were one of the people that suggested this book, so I'm going to get to the end where he finds a solution to this. So he says, 1, obligations entail reasons. 2, reasons must be capable of motivating. 3, motivational capacity is relative to attitudes. And 4, therefore, obligations are relative to attitudes. So even if there was some sort of objective principle out there that one ought to follow, it's still going to be such the case that obligations are relative towards my attitudes. So I could have some sort of obligatory thing out there in the world, but I'm still not going to do it because it's just not tied to the type of attitude that I have. How would we overcome something like this? It seems as though one of the types of things that we could do to have a solution to this is that if there is something intrinsically unconditionally good within every person, then one could sort of say that, well, it's not just that there's just these objective, coercive things out there existing within the world, because they're not going to coerce me in any sort of sense. I won't even give a damn unless I have something about me that's going to let them be coercive towards the type of thing that I am. And so we can't just end in dispositional qualities or certain types of natures that I have that might be radically contingent among every single human being. They have to be something necessary of every rational human being, such that these coercive forces don't just sort of cling on to me like a hook, right, and force me to do it, but they motivate me to do it because of that sort of inner sort of unconditional principle. They motivate me. And bring out, to use Kantian language, the moral feeling within me.
If someone had no moral feeling, would it be fair to punish them, for example? Would it be fair to say that they're still under an obligation? I'm getting a feel for your question now. I mean, there's so much to say here. It's so much good stuff. Okay, let me just throw out one idea. So, does it make sense to punish or put people under obligations when it's not fully up to them whether they comply. It's not fully up to their reason to comply. Can you punish things? Can you punish people when it's not their fault? I mean, in general, you want to say no, but there's certain cases. So think about strict liability in private law. So the classic example, if you rear end somebody, it doesn't matter if your car was out of your control. You're liable for the damage. You have to pay for the new fender one way or another. Now, it could be that it wasn't really up to you in some sense, because your car just had an unpredictable failure, or there was a freak ice storm, or whatever it might be. Still, I think it's normal to have obligations that to some extent outstrip what we're totally under control as far as doing, because sometimes it just doesn't make sense to peer inside everybody's head before laying down the law. I mean, it's just hard to know who's at fault in a car crash. So if we have a rule promulgated in advance, everybody can be under an obligation, figure it out, and we don't have to spend $1 billion investigating every car wreck that happened. There's a sense in which this is a little bit non-ideal. Better if every time someone was at fault, the bill got sent to them, and every time they're not at fault, the bill doesn't get sent. But in the real world, we can't always have that. Sometimes obligations have a little bit of residue, and they attach in ways that don't perfectly mirror the sphere of reasons. So I find this stuff all totally fascinating. And so strict liability might be an example of where obligations outstrip rationality.
So let's get into some, I guess, since we're fairly in, we're fairly far in right now. We're reaching the 2-hour point. Let's kind of dip ourselves into ontological and metaphysical questions. So
sure.
what are the types of metaphysical commitments or metaethical commitments that you sort of have? I guess starting with the idea that, do you have some form of non-naturalism that you'd subscribe to? Do you think that there exist ethical norms that are out there within the world? Do you think that there's a asymmetry or a symmetry between epistemic norms and ethical norms? If you may kind of answer some of these.
I think there is a symmetry between moral norms and epistemic norms. You can be criticized for not sort of weighing up your evidence correctly. You can be criticized for not weighing up your reasons correctly. Though I think there's a deeper question of whether rights have any role in believing, whether supererogation has any analog in the epistemic realm. I actually think it does. People say, it's my opinion, leave me alone. Sometimes you do have to leave them alone, but sometimes you don't. I think flat earthers are not just doing the epistemic minimum, they are really failing. But meanwhile, someone who holds a belief that you disagree with, but you see how it's kind of reasonable, think, well, that is to some extent decent. I can't just go on harping on at them. They've done a little bit of due diligence. So that would be like the epistemic analog, perhaps, keeping your kidney. Okay, but then the ontological stuff. I actually started out as a meta-ethicist. I was a meta-ethics fiend. I read On What Matters as an undergraduate and was just transfixed. I was like, this guy, Derek Parfit, is on another level. I desperately wanted to, be a part of the project of meta-ethics that he was doing. I burned out, though. I burned out real hard. So I got to my PhD. I took nothing but meta-ethics classes. I even got to take a class with Parfit as he was working on What Matters Volume 3.
Must have been exciting.
It was a letdown.
Oh.
Some days were exciting. But a lot of it felt ineffably frustrating. Like I got the sense that in metaethics, as it was being done in that corner of the world at that time, there was a lot of verbal disputes. I got the sense that there was a lot of hair splitting, and there was a lot of stalemates. You know, there was this stalemate between the people who thought ethics is about, you know, real truths out there, people who thought ethics was basically about emotions, and then people were trying really hard and maybe succeeding at showing that these views don't really even come apart at the end of that. I got burned out real fast. And normative ethics, I just felt like I just had more stuff to say about it. I don't know how to put it, but the idea of the self-other symmetry that came to me around that time just seemed to unlock puzzles, and it seemed to me to like break up the stalemate between consequentialists and deontologists in a way that like I just didn't know how to break up the stalemate between moral realists and moral anti-realists, between non-naturalists and naturalists. So I mean, no offense to metaethics, I think there's some cool stuff going on there, but you know, I got a little bit disillusioned, at least with what role I could play in that field. Hope you don't mind. Sorry, this is a little bit more biographical.
Sure, yeah. No, I mean, I think metaphysics and ontology can definitely be quite frustrating. Although there does seem to be a line, at least for me, in the Pittsburgh school with people like McDowell, Brandom, and Sellers, particularly Sellers, that seems to, McDowell rather, sorry, that seems to find a fairly clever solution on how to resolve this sort of naturalism versus non-naturalistic view by saying that we should just rather view nature as already being reason-giving, full of norms, and conceptually latent, instead of necessarily being something that's non-conceptual and then concepts are sort of tossed onto it. So I think the meta-ethicists, certainly, you know, any sort of meta-ethicist that you're sort of familiar with, already sort of came across this, but they didn't sort of complete the job, in my opinion, by making the rest of nature normative, just mostly ethical properties as being normative. But if you if you view
on that just for a moment. Go ahead. You finish your thought.
Yeah, I think if you do sort of endorse this type of symmetry between epistemic norms as being normative and epistemic norms as, you know, having sort of continuity with ethical norms, or practical reason, if you wish. That if you're endorsing one, you're generally if you have one, you're basically saying that they have some sort of marriage together. Then I think what you ultimately come down to is that maybe both of them are going to have some sort of external basis within the world. I tend to also have an identity theory of truth, so generally the type of content that I have in my experience is going to be of the world, and so I would agree with an ethical, robust realist, but I would also tend to think that natural properties have some sort of normativity to them as well.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating nexus of issues. So, you know, modern metaethics started with the idea that all language had to be doing the same kind of thing. You know, there's different ways to put this, but think about A.J. Ayer. The start of modern non-cognitivism starts with the verificationist idea that meaningful language.
If I may interrupt you, though, but
go ahead.
Yeah, what about people like Carnap who would want to create sort of regional distinctions between forms of discourse? I mean, within, say, ethics or agency, or are you familiar with what I mean with this sort of Carnapian thesis?
No, that's a good point. I'm perhaps to some extent oversimplifying here,
okay.
But I think you'll see what I mean in a moment.
Okay.
So when you know, Ayer interacts with people like Carnap and hears about this idea that all meaningful language boils down to verification conditions. You know, what experiences would verify the statement?
Mm-hmm.
He comes back to ethics and says, okay, is this verifiable? No. Well, then, look, moral language, whatever it's doing, It better be this or it's meaningless. And so so he ends up saying it's meaningless and comes up with some subsidiary thing for it to do, express emotions.
Right.
So, it's the boo hurrah theory of moral language.
If I may, just for the sake of the audience, because I do think that this is a very important issue that you just raised, and I'm not even sure if I know the answer to it, but the sort of verification thesis that you have here is sort of show an asymmetry between ethics and epistemic norms. Is the way that I see it follows like this. Within scientific norms, right, where we get to generate certain types of nomenological laws, although I actually don't believe in those, but let's say that I hypothetically do, or any sort of things that we can create scientific experiments from, we have a way of verifying that those exist because consequences exist if I don't believe in certain types of things like planetary motion, gravity or whatever. I can go outside and verify whether these things exist through experiment or just by being out there, say if it's raining, and I don't think it's raining. But there doesn't seem to be a sort of way of verifying ethics. So even if we believe in normativity existing outside, there doesn't seem to be the same form of verification within ethical systems as there are within epistemic systems, or scientific systems. And I'm not sure how to resolve that asymmetry myself.
No, it's a super tough question. But to put another spin on it, what would even count as evidence for a moral theory? So demanding that all evidence be ultimately pure experience, maybe that's a bit unfair to ethics. Maybe you're stacking the deck against it. But there's still this challenge of okay, we know how to get evidence for scientific theory, run some experiments, churn out some probabilities. How do you get evidence for one version of deontology, like my view, versus consequentialism? I actually think that there's a surprisingly tight parallel. You do experiments. In ethics, you look to thought experiments, usually, but you can also do real-world cases if they're clean enough. So you have a principle. Maybe it just comes to you, maybe it's something that you read in a book, but someone has a principle, like you always have to promote the greatest happiness. That makes predictions, just like a scientific theory makes predictions. It says of a bunch of cases, including ones you haven't thought about yet, how they're going to turn out. So if you want to get evidence, go look at those cases. So let's suppose we look at the case of kidney donation. Would it promote the greatest happiness to donate my kidney? Well, let's suppose yes. Does it seem like I have to do it? Well, no. So that counts against the principle. Now, by contrast, if a theory makes predictions that turn out true, so you think about some cases you hadn't considered yet and it looks like they're true one after another, that to me is the best kind of evidence you can get for a theory. And then this all, however, supposes that we can make case judgments. And that can be puzzling in itself, right? Because it's easy to know what we're doing when we think about case judgments, quote unquote, in science. Did the light turn on? Did the strip turn red? That kind of. They're pretty easy ways to tell whether an experiment went well. I'm simplifying a lot, but you might worry that to know whether it's permissible to give my kidney, that requires some impossible epistemic feat. You can't just use intuition. There I disagree. I do think that you can just know, or at least provisionally know. You don't have to give your kidney. But that means that case judgments in ethics really, 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 and any threat to our ability to make these judgments threatens to burn the whole thing down.
Do you have because I know the direction that you're going to, but I guess I didn't understand the sort of thought experiment or the way of the sort of verification thesis that you offered here for ethics. Do you have any other sort of a way of kind of going about and explaining that for me?
Yeah, let me give another example.
Yeah, I do find this interesting. I do find this subject fascinating. One of the types of objections that I sometimes hear against moral realism is precisely this, right? That
Mm.
Even if the world was normative and gave us reasons for believing X over Y, that we should do X over Y, it doesn't have ways of sort of auxiliary reasons of sort of motivating us to accept this norm over another norm like science does with verification, if that makes sense.
So is the thought morality gives us one way of living, but there's no independent reason why that's the best way?
Um,
Let me. I feel like I didn't quite get your question.
there's no. So I let's say that the world gives me certain types of reasons for why I should adopt a certain type of belief.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that I not to murder or something like that. There doesn't seem to be any sort of falsification or any sort of consequence to endorsing the exact opposite belief, right? Because I can also hold the belief that murdering is not wrong, and there's no real consequence to adopting that belief, right? Whereas there is a sort of consequence of adopting the belief that it's not raining outside while I step
I
outside
see.
and then get rained on, right? Uh,
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Are there any consequences for getting moral reality wrong? Um,
well, there might be
well, there's
institutional consequences, but
exactly.
I'm wondering if there are certain types of non-institutional consequences that we can sort of transparently see, and there might not be. I mean, ethics might just function in a uniquely sui generis manner.
I mean, it does seem like ethics is somehow social, or at least parts of it are. I mentioned earlier that rights seem to come from joint decisions, what Kant called a uniting or pooling of wills.
Mm-hmm.
You might think that moral norms in general really show themselves in social contexts. So I think this is actually how the psychology of morality is starting to shake out in the field of psychology. So what are we even thinking? To put your question another way, what are we even thinking when we think that murder? I know what I'm thinking when I think there's a table here. I'm thinking about a concrete object. I'm thinking that if I move my hand this way, it'll get pushed back. I'm thinking that if I move my toe this way, it'll get stubbed. What am I thinking when I think that murder is wrong? Well, I mean, in the old days, well, not necessarily, but when in the days when if you think that there's a God that will punish wrongdoers, then you have an answer. You get your
Right.
metaphysical
Yeah.
toe stubbed by going to hell someday.
Right. Yeah. That's
Now,
it's the ultimate verification. I mean, if we could somehow, I mean, at
but
least
what
for
if we
the
don't have it?
individual.
What if we
Yeah.
don't have it? Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
I think that's the heart of your question. What if there is no ultimate verification after you die? Um, that is the radical contingency of morality, I think. It is the only consequences that get felt are social. In the psychology of morality, I think people are finding that when you think it's wrong, what you're really thinking is something like, I don't get to be one of us. I'm not part of the group if I do this. Um, and there's a lot of like social reality to this statement. What happens when you do wrong stuff? You get
Hmm.
ostracized. Just like when you do stuff that's illegal, you become a little bit more like an outlaw.
Hmm.
Your rights are stripped away and so on. Now, does that mean that there's nothing beyond these consequences to moral thinking and moral truth? That's the meta ethics question that I don't know how to answer. But I am interested in the you might say I'm interested in the social manifestation of these moral issues.
This is exactly the issue that I'm starting to grapple with myself, Daniel. This sort of need for a verification principle, because then people can toss out asymmetries between epistemic norms within the sciences and and types of norms within morality. Uh, Another type of you're familiar with the companions and guilt argument, right, Daniel?
Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
for the audience in this room, the companions and guilt argument is basically, well, if there's a symmetry between our moral reasoning and our epistemic reasoning. That is to say, that generally how we maneuver be in just the sciences or everyday know-hows. That if we're going to begin questioning the foundations of our moral norms, then we're going to have to also begin to question the foundations of our just our everyday epistemic norms. And we can't do that because if we begin questioning our epistemic norms, then the very normativity of the very establishment of the normativity that there is no such thing as an epistemic norm becomes undermined, and therefore we get into sort of reductio. But there have been sort of asymmetries or disparities within the companions and guilt argument. By Cowie, I think, was one of them who mentioned that the asymmetry between those two actually lies in the idea that, well, in virtue of epistemic norms being the way that they are definite. I mean, they are sort of self-defeating if you reject those, while in morality there doesn't seem to be anything self-defeating if you reject all moral claims. And so that disparities then shows us that they're not symmetrical, that they might be asymmetrical. And this is a sort of, I think, perplexing issue also for me. I know there's been a few responses given to that, but I haven't found too many of them satisfying. I mean, have you looked into any of this literature, Daniel, or are you also sort of stumped on some of these issues as well?
It's been a minute. I haven't looked into it much since the aforementioned burnout on Meta.
I see.
Is it somehow self-defeating to forego moral norms? I mean, I think it depends on what you mean by foregoing them. You know, is it self-defeating to believe that they're not? I don't think that's true. I don't think it's self-defeating. You could just be wrong without being inconsistent. Whereas, I mean, that's because you're using your epistemic rationality to think about practical rationality, different domain. But you know, there is something funny about not believing in any practical norms more generally. So believing that it doesn't matter what we do at all, and then going on with your life. Every decision that you make seems to reflect some kind of judgment about what you should do, right? To say that you're acting at all, rather than flailing around, or just kind of moving like a contraption moves. Say that you're acting. I think, like, when you unpack that notion, it means you're acting in light of some stance you take on the world about what matters. To be an agent, to be a rational agent at least, is to be moved by your conception of what's a good idea. So to me, there is something self-defeating about rejecting all practical, and then continuing to go act as if things did really matter. And I don't think you can act in a way that means that things don't really matter, because to act rationally is to act for reasons.
I tend to think that one can't do away with all hypothetical norms as well. Although they would, I mean, some skeptics would just say, well, certainly we can't get rid of all hypothetical norms. It's the categorical norms that I'm wary of. If there's any sort of way of clearing those out, is there any sort of self-defeating argument there? And there doesn't seem to be. I mean, from the two books that you gave me to read, it seems most meta-ethicists don't want to argue for robust moral realism with self-defeating arguments or a priori deductions of that sort anymore. But you know more about that literature than I do.
I don't know. You seem to know your stuff.
So let's go. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, why do we look for arguments that involve self-defeat? That's an interesting question. Why is it that people feel the need to show the moral skeptic that they're defeating themselves? Why is it enough to just lose? Well, what about getting defeated by somebody else? I think that often you look for self-defeat arguments when you're skeptical about the subject matter to start. Right? You wanted to say that the moral skeptic defeats himself because you're not comfortable leaning on morality and saying, look, you're getting this wrong. One reason why I think it's interesting and worth exploring arguments involving self-defeat. But if you're a normative ethicist like me, that I think you're probably pretty comfortable with ethics in itself. I read a lot of ethics papers. I read a lot of ethics arguments. And after a while, I start to see that some views make a lot more sense than others. Do I need to show that someone's internally incoherent, don't like my faith? I don't think so. I just want to show them the reasons for and against their view. Like, are flat earthers self-defeating, for example? Well, maybe it'd be nice to be able to show that they are. But if you're comfortable with astronomy, you just show that they're defeated by astronomy. Similarly, if you're comfortable with normative ethics, I think you're comfortable saying to the moral skeptic, you're just wrong about murder. No matter whether you're wrong about sort of your own internal incoherence.
Right. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes some sense. Although, I mean, when it plays out in a social in a sort of dialectic, the moral realist ends up getting the sort of short end of the stick, if you know what I mean, right? Then it's going to be a sort of appeal to consequence of some sort. Then it's going to be relying upon intuitions or institutional norms that can't be grounded. And I think that while I sympathize with you, because people who ask these sorts of ultimate foundational grounding questions have a very hard duty to themselves. I mean, a very hard commitment. I think there has been, at least, in a lot of literature that I've read, really good answers to even like insane skeptical dilemmas. Like external object skepticism is one of the things that I had a recent conversation about, and I think that there is an interesting solution to that. I think there's an interesting solutions. I recently read Stephen Mumford about denying, certain things like causation. I don't think we can just be conventionalists or say causal primitivists about causation anymore. I certainly don't think we can be conventionalists about epistemic norms all the way through, because that's the notion of even coming to the semantical agreement of what is a convention, right, presupposes that we need a normative assessment of what a convention is, which of course can't be convention in itself, because how are we going to create convention before convention, right? How are we going to, with issues pertaining to causality, how are we going to be conventionalist about that? Presumably because we're creating conventions, we're going to have to admit that we're in some sense causal realists. So there's entertaining things here. Even with problematic issues, I think, like other minds, I think there's also some interesting rebuttals to that. For example, other minds seem to presuppose. Our minds seem to presuppose a certain type of ability to use language, right? So what I mean by that is that, at least in some capacity, to talk about human minds like our own, and the concepts that one sort of implements when talking about our own agency, we need to presuppose a language. But as we know from Wittgenstein and the private language argument, right, language presupposes norms, and norms can only be established by a sort of interactive community of some sort, a causal interactive community. And so a causal interactive community of that sort is the only way that I can actually establish my mind. And via establishing my own mind through that causal interactive community of other types of thinkers, I sort of have to presuppose other types of minds before I can get into my own mind. Sort of, some of these sorts of interesting solutions to the problems of other minds. And, and then we have other types of skeptical dilemmas between how do I know I can even envision the external world altogether? How do I know that I'm just not perceiving my own sense data and my own experiences? And Sellers and McDowell have really interesting answers to that, and that is by attacking the notion of sense data altogether, or personal experiences that are somehow incorrigibly known to us. Those can't just be taken for granted. The notion of the concept of appearance can't just be taken for granted, because appearances presuppose vertical
Reality.
experiences. We have to have a criterion of reality before we have a criterion of error, right? So there's, as you know, since you went into studying metaethics and issues of grounding, there's solutions to, I think, some of these issues, and I think that there might be good solutions one day, maybe there are right now, to issues concerning robust moral realism. So yeah. I have at least hope there. What's that?
I'll take any solution I can get. Anything that lets me stay in business. Marty, do you mind if I ask you? Shall we go back to the chat and see if there are any questions there?
Yeah. I actually have to take a break. Quick break. Do you see the questions in front of you so you could read them out loud?
I do.
Okay. Would you mind taking the wheel for a second while I step out, and you could begin answering some of these questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Why don't I just go from the freshest questions, and I'll go up.
Okay.
So Agnes Domini asks, it seems strange to me that in this entire discussion of ethics, that religion has not been brought into the discourse, because the primary function of religion is to instruct us as to what is or is not good or evil. So most cultures' grounding on ethical conduct stems from religious instruction. Interesting. So why not talk about religion when we're talking about ethics? Well, definitely if there is a God and we have obligations to that God, that is going to change the moral field, right? Just as whether or not you have a best friend might change what you have to do. Suddenly there's going to be one day of the year where you have to get a birthday present stuff. If there's a God, that changes things. Does that show, however, that God is the ultimate grounding of morality? Well, that is another question. I think some people have assumed that God, if he exists, has got to be the ultimate ground of morality. But this doesn't seem so obvious to me. I mean, for one thing, there is this question of how God could make things matter morally. It doesn't seem to me that it's up to God or up to anybody whether murder is wrong. If you kill someone and you have no right to do it, that's just wrong, period, no matter what anyone says. Similarly, it's not up to God whether 2 + 2 = 4. It's not up to anyone whether 2 + 2 = 4. That's just what it equals. So actually some religious thinkers, religious ethicists, have dealt with this by saying that just as math and perhaps physics are like things that God created and they have their own independent existence now, ethics is like that. Ethics isn't applied theology, just like math isn't applied theology. It's its own thing. It has a kind of autonomy, even if there wouldn't be anything without a God. So, I mean, I myself am not religious, though I used to be, but I think that there should be agreement between religious and non-religious ethicists that, like math and physics, you had to study ethics on its own terms. It's not applied theology, but it's its own field. And Agnes Domini says, well, not all religions have the same rules and the same gods, so we need to be careful that we're not focusing on Western notions herein. No, true. I mean, different religions will mean different things for ethics. So, whether we reincarnate might change to some extent. How bad is it to murder someone if they get to come back as a super being? So we had to be sensitive to this kind of stuff. But regardless, I think that some of the basic principles of morality just hold independent of beliefs about supernatural stuff. So I think that there can be a fruitful dialogue. And it's a good thing that there can be, because issues about law and about public morality have to be decided on more or less publicly available grounds. Otherwise, you're religiously oppressing people. Okay, Mood 61 says, it seems like a perspective treated moral claims and religious coextensive would adequately account for categorical, scientifically parsimonious way in virtue of the common usage of the language term good. Are you thinking that we would say moral claims and religious claims, that morality is like a religion? And we can see this from thinking about ordinary language. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, maybe there is a notion of moral faith. It's hard to sort of get into ethics except by a leap. It's hard to talk somebody into ethics if they're not already getting some intuitions. But to me, it's in a way a bit of a non-issue. I think that so much of our ethical thought is innate, and stuff that's not innate is at least explicable in terms of joint decisions, cultural, or ordinary garden variety errors that can be corrected. So there's some analogies between religion and ethics, but I think that ethics is something that we should have less agreement over, and that I think you can believe in and should believe in ethics, regardless of your religious belief. Oh, okay. So going, Agnes Domini says, how would you not a divine being? Well, I don't think that most people in practice get their ethics from divine beings. You know, of course, you read religious texts, person, but if you think that what you're doing is just applied Bible studies, when you go around and answer your friends' questions, what should I do? Should I take this job? Should I give my kidney? Is it permissible to? I mean, to take a difficult question that my city is asking right now: should we hard lock down some public housing projects to prevent coronavirus outbreaks? I dare you to find an answer to this question in the Bible. I mean, I'm not saying that the Bible doesn't have questions. And conditional on being a theist, I think you should obviously be looking to your religion for answers. But moral thinking that we do day to day is, to some extent, autonomous from any religious thought that we have. Just like mathematical thinking and thinking about physics. So I don't even feel too puzzled about the foundations of morality, because I find that moral thinking comes so naturally, and that there are lots of puzzles, but it seems like we're making progress. The next one: would I be amenable to guesting again and devoting the show to my dissertation topic? Yeah, that'd be cool. Oh, thanks for the question, Mood61. Thanks for all these questions. These are like super good questions. It's like better than Q&As at conferences. Honestly, this is super audience. I would love to come back if Marty would have me and just talk about the dissertation topic. I'm actually writing a book on this.
Oh, that's good.
The question of what we owe to ourselves, the connection between self and other. I'm really excited to be writing a book about this stuff, and it would just be a total blast to talk about it again. Oh, yeah. Do I buy into Oh, sorry. I'm blabbing on with the questions. Marty, go ahead. Welcome back.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, we'd love to have you on. I mean, we do a show every Tuesday and Thursday, so content is definitely needed. Although we can do another one with some Q&A and the same thing, you talking about your dissertation topic. I do one day want to. And by the way, the people that I have on here are pretty cordial, so it shouldn't be a concern. But I do wanted to.
Oh, I could tell.
I wanted to maybe entertain the possibility of having multiple guests on talking about some of these issues. And I think you'll find that most of the people that I would have on air would be sympathetic to robust moral realism and normative ethical questions such as these. So if that's something that you're also interested in having a sort of dialogue with at least one other person alongside with me in the future.
Oh, absolutely.
That's good.
I think it'd be a blast.
So yeah, we can continue since we're about 2 hours and about 10 minutes in. We could probably finish this off with some Q&A and then probably call it a day for this one, since it's starting to get a little bit late for me here, and we've been definitely doing this for some time. So yeah,
Indeed.
um, if you don't mind though, Daniel, if we can kind of proceed a little bit backwards before we do any of the recent questions, so we don't miss anyone that's asked a question like an hour ago or so.
Yeah, let's do it.
Um, so let me look. I'm trying to look for question marks here. Um, so one of the questions back here: does smoking addiction weigh the choice to smoke so much that the smoker, while acting autonomously, might resent the fact that such a decision is so appealing that it appeals to such a base, undesirable, and unfulfilling component of autonomy, which, in a hierarchical sense, the smoker might wish to subjugate with more desirable wants? That's a very long question. If you wanna,
Oh, I think I get the question. I think the the person asking this question is really seeing smoking as non-autonomous in the sense that I'm talking, right? So they're saying, on some level, I wish I didn't have this desire. I don't really endorse this desire. That is the sign of non-autonomy. Um, Autonomy means sort of on every level, you look down and think, ah, what a great desire. I'm all about that. So if the smoker resents it, I think there's a bit of non-autonomy. But then there's another question buried in this, which is it possible to be conflicted in autonomy? Is it possible to think, I do want this, this is me, but I don't like it? um,
I mean,
that's
that
a
goes
tough
back.
question.
This question goes all the way back to Plato and the daemon. I mean, having
Oh, indeed.
sort of a bifurcation amongst oneself with oneself. So, I mean, if one definitely believes that something like that, and I think one should, that there's a sort of split between how one views the subject. I mean, in a sense, there isn't. I sort of endorse
Hmm.
something like the transcendental unity of a perception that Kant gives, but in another sense, we do have very many sort of dispositional roles. We sort of subscribe to our passions very often, and those that we don't seem to have control of. You know, we seem to have maybe some indirect control of, but not direct control of, and we definitely want to
Right.
have some sort of divide there.
You don't get to pick your emotions in the moment.
Correct. Yeah.
If only, you know, we'd have so much less breakup music. It would be, human experience would be totally different. So I mean, we're used to being torn like this, and I don't think it's a sign of pathology to feel torn. I do think it's a reflection of us not being under control at each moment, though. To that extent, it's a kind of non-autonomy. It shows the limits of our control, but it's different from what you might call a non-autonomous action because the stuff that we don't like isn't controlling us. We can't decide to get rid of the pesky emotions. We can't decide to be over breakup. We can't decide to be done with smoking and not want the craving. Um, we can't eliminate the craving by sheer rationality of willing it away, but we can not act on the craving. So to that extent, we're acting autonomously, even if you can see some disharmony within our minds. The Plato reference is a great reference. It's totally that kind of thing.
Sure. So the next question is, do you talk about? Could you talk about how the moral supervenes on the natural, but that doesn't necessarily imply naturalism in metaethics?
What is naturalism and metaethics? I sometimes wonder what the hell position is supposed to be. If naturalism means what it did for 100 years ago, it means that ethics is basically applied physics or applied psychology or something like that.
Right.
Ethics is in its own autonomous field.
I think that is what they mean. I generally, when people talk about naturalism, they mean sort of classic naturalism, but I understand the distinction you're making. It's
Right, because once you get beyond that way of seeing naturalism, you have a lot more options. You can say that somehow things' moral properties spring their non-moral property.
right.
Pain
Uh,
sucks because of how it feels.
Yeah, and with this type of question, I think there's, I think we need to be a little bit skeptical. There could be some sort of supervenience relationship on the natural, which does not imply a sort of reductive form of naturalism. And
Indeed.
I think we can, and if I, I don't want to steal and hog your time here, but Daniel, but we
No, no, no,
see,
go for it.
I tend to have very non-reductionistic tendencies. So I think that we see all sorts of even physical events which are non-reductive, that sort of supervene on the original, maybe if you want to call it more base physical theories, but are nonetheless have certain types of causal properties which aren't just dependent upon those base physical properties.
Hmm.
So to give an example, right, and I've given this one again many times in this chat room, um, and Stephen Mumford gives a pretty unique example within chemical bonding. Uh, One can kind of talk about salt, and the monadic properties of salt are, sodium chloride, chlorine, and taken alone, right, sodium and chlorine, one's highly combustive, and then the other one is highly, um, God, I can't even remember off the top of my head, combustive and poisonous, of course, chlorine being
Hmm. Hmm.
poisonous. And we put them together, right? We put them in sort of
Yes.
a chemical bonding, and we get something that's neither combustive or poisonous, right? And assuming if you think that everything works as a sort of aggregate, then you would expect it's very poisonous and very combustive, even more so, right? But in fact, you get something novel. You get a sort of causal power that's novel there, that actually um, negates the original causal properties. To
Hmm.
even if we do have a supervenience relationship of the sort that
Right.
chemistry depends upon particle physics of some sort, and maybe biology does on chemistry, there are certain types of causal chains that work top down instead of bottom up, and this is how I see sort of human agency as working as well, sort of a top down approach. So our intentional actions being sui generis, being sort of a unique type, even though they depend on the natural to some extent. We obviously need a body, we obviously need a brain in order to have any sort of idea of what we're talking about in ethics. That does not necessarily imply complete and full reductive forms of naturalism, right? So,
I I totally love that example, and uh, I mean, both as an analogy for agents, ethics. So with ethics, I mean, you just have to understand things at their own level. If you try to treat ethics as applied psychology or something, you're just going to miss the texture of ethical questions.
right.
Um, I mean, there's even like in principle reasons why this is hard to carry out this reductive. Because suppose you want to do psychology to understand people's ethical intuitions. Well, you have to have cases that you give people to survey them. Well, how do you know that you've got the cases right? How do you know that you've really got a minimal pair that you've asked them about the trolley problem, correct, or whatever? Well, you have to have some familiarity with how the trolley work. You have to have some fluency with more concepts to know that you've set up the right. Uh, I just this is a slightly separate point from what you were getting at, but I think it just shows that you have to understand ethics on terms you want to understand at all. I mean, more
Yeah,
generally, right? Well, what's the goal in studying ethics? Is it just to get undeniable truth that coheres with your picture of fundamental reality, to never get anything wrong? If so, then you might want to work bottom up from the fundamental stuff, um, and pray that you don't run into sodium chloride nonsense. Truths pop out unexpectedly. Um, I don't have that approach though. I want to understand salt. I just want to fully understand ethics in a mind-blowing way possible.
I mean, sure.
And
Yeah.
right, I mean, you almost never get your mind blown doing reductive projects unless the project happens to be ripe for a reduction.
Um,
I guess to some extent I would do some reduction. I reduce supererogation to, but I don't try to reduce everything to psychology
I mean,
because that doesn't seem to blow anyone's mind.
certainly there's some things that I think are reductive, that we could have sort of reductive explanations for. So, addiction and why we're addicted to cigarettes, since we named this one earlier, does have a fairly easy causal and reductive explanation. We need not look into intentional actions and ethics and the web of normativity, in order to give a sort of physical demonstration of how our biology is working and giving an account of why we're picking up the cigarette. But we do need to give one for certain types of things that aren't going to be given in merely causal explanations, such as, the cigarette example, right? And maybe
yes.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Can I riff on this? So a great normative ethicist named Tom Hurt has a great distinction. So some people are looking for what you might call external explanations of moral stuff. They want to explain something in terms of something different, very different, clearly different. So for example, Rawls wants to explain justice in terms of what kind of agreement would it be rational for us to make if we didn't know who. So would you want to live in a capitalist society, know who you were going to be, the capitalist or the worker? Or would you want to live in a socialist? That's a kind of external project that Rawls is understanding justice in terms of something very different. And the person who reduces all of ethics psychology, reduction. They're reducing morality to something that seems very different, like desire or what have you. So I am interested in what her inherent explanations. That's when you explain something in terms of a related concept. So you're not trying to reduce it to something random, but you're dealing with stuff that's clearly got to be linked. That's how I see supererogation. I think the question, do I have to give my kidney, is similar to the question, do I have to take this kidney from a non-consenting? You're really dealing with rights both times. And it's inherent to the notion of supererogation. It's not external to it. So I love a good explanation. I love a good reduction. But I'm not interested in reduction for the sake of metaphysics or for the sake of parsimony. I want to maximize mind-blowing, right? I want to see the connections that are most interesting and illuminating. And so that's why I only go for inherent explanations.
The issue with parsimony, and I don't want to go too far into this, but parsimony, some people sort of misunderstand it. It isn't that we need the most simplest explanation, but we need the most simplest explanation that can actually explain for everything else. And a lot of reductive accounts tend not to explain everything that that needs to be explaining, right? That's why we have problems of underdetermination. So for reductive accounts, we need to overdetermine the facts of certain types of instances. And luckily, at least a lot of literature that I've come from, we haven't been able to do that. And this shouldn't mean that the world is, in a sense, magical or mysterious. It means that the world is just complex, very complex, to the degree that it needs multiple forms of explanation, and we should be okay with that.
Right.
We should be okay with the idea of not everything needing to be a sort of having a mechanical explanation to it without it necessarily being magic. Here's another question. No, actually, hold on. That was the last question. Can honoring consent have normative value given that it does not affect the person giving or restricting consent? For example, not wanting a certain kind of funeral. If it does not, does consent have non-contingent value? Question.
I think consent has contingent value. It depends on whether the person has a right over the stuff they're consenting to. So suppose I don't consent to Marty having hash browns for breakfast. It's like, well, no one asked me because it's not my business.
I had them yesterday, actually.
A very fine choice. I love hash browns. So now, if I say I don't consent to Marty taking my hash browns out of my freezer, okay, well, there's some value in honoring that because it's my stuff, you know. So consent has contingent value. It's valuable insofar as the consent really has a right. And with funerals, that's a little bit of an open question. Is it really your right how people celebrate you or remember you? To some extent, perhaps yes. But like, suppose I say, I don't want anyone to ever read my first book again because I didn't like how it turned out. Is there value in honoring that consent? Well, to some extent, but like to some extent, I give up the right to keep the book secret when I publish it, and it's unreasonable for me to expect that people will respect my wishes on. You know, if I go out into public with a sign that says "Don't you dare look at me," are people violating my consent, privacy, by looking at me? I mean, it's like, dude, I knew what I was getting into when I stepped outside. It's no longer reasonable to expect that I have a right over privacy when I expose myself. So in that way, consent is contingent.
So we got two more questions. Do you buy into Kant's notion of grounding, I'm guessing ethics, in human reason?
I don't think that you can work out all of ethics by thinking about human reason very carefully and turning the rationality crank. I think that you can't derive ethics from rationality like that. I do think that big chunks of ethics make a lot more sense when you see them as flowing from decision making, right? So I think that how consent works is it's a kind of joint decision, right? Consent is like an input to a joint decision. You say, go ahead, and I say, all right. And together we've made a decision. We've done what Kant would call pooling our wills. Now, does this idea of pooling our wills together tell us everything we need to know about rights? I'm not so sure. It seems like maybe we do have some rights, like the right not to be killed, that don't come from joint decisions that we've made. They're natural rights. If, however, there are no natural rights, we probably could reduce all of rights to the outcomes of joint decisions. That's what Gilbert thinks. Gilbert thinks that if I sneak up behind I've never causally interacted with, and I whack them on the head, I infringe absolutely zero rights because we never decided that I would. Now, if you believe that, you can derive all the rights from joint decisions, and that's a kind of Kantian. But if you think that
I think you're breaking up a little bit right now, Daniel.
Oh shit! Sorry. Did you hear the thing about whacking someone on the?
Yeah. No, you're mostly coming through, but like every 3 or 4 seconds, like you pause for like half a second. So.
Ah, damn. Well, point being, I think that thinking about rationality and decision making is helpful for ethics, but you can't derive all of ethics from it.
I hear you there. So I think we got one more question, and then we'll wrap it up here, Daniel, because we've been almost at the 3-hour mark. So would a theist combine the instruction of their holy book alongside another moral system? I'm guessing that's just a sort of question of whether you would think that that's something that's permissible for you,
It seems
Daniel.
like the way to go. Conditional on theism. So if you believe that something's telling you the truth, then you should believe it. And unless it tells you something absolutely wacky, then you should revise your original. But conditional on theism, you should obviously take seriously. But I don't think that it's at all practical to think that all morality can be read off of any book. I mean, I'm writing a book. I hope that you don't take all of your ethics from me. Right? Like this is an amazing, fascinating, irreducibly complex skill that moral judgment. And don't believe anybody who tells you that they have all the answers.
Okay. So I mean that was the last question, I think. I hope I didn't miss any other ones. Would you want any sort of closing comments, Daniel? Anything else that you kind of want to talk about before we wrap this show up right here?
I suppose the last thing to say would be about self-other symmetry, and the golden rule to bring it all back around.
Okay.
How are you supposed to think about choice to give to other people? How does all this ethics talk really matter? Well, I just encourage you, facing a decision like, am I allowed to do this? I have to give this. Do the little tests, right? So imagine, am I allowed to harm myself? Could you do that? Am I required to give? Would you be required to take from a non-consenting other? Similar position. Ethics is do systematically. It seems, but that just means that anytime we have a pattern, test, way of pumping our imagination, like the self-other symmetry, we better exploit it to the fullest extent. And in my case, at least, I found that it was really helpful because I'm not an egoist. I actually find it very hard to care about myself to other people. And sometimes imagining myself as another person, as if like I've just been given responsibility to take care of this random dude, Daniel. Sometimes it becomes much easier to make correct choices. And I see that maybe I'm as valuable as I can value effortlessly. Well, I hope that thought is of some use to as well as me.
Definitely. Let's do this one last question. What is going to be the title of your book, Daniel, before we wrap this up? Or do you have
What we owe to ourselves? What we owe to ourselves.
And that's the book that Daniel's going to be coming up with. Hopefully, once he's done with it, some of you guys will take an interest and purchase that book. I definitely will be probably reading it, Daniel, if you offer it to me one day.
Hey, man, I'll come back and give away a copy. If you don't mind a giveaway. To whoever asked the nicest, most flattering question.
Okay. All right. Well, let's wrap up this episode for the philosophy chat. Thanks again, Daniel, for coming on here. Once again, this has been a conversation with Daniel, who has gotten his PhD just recently. And once again, congratulations and thank you for coming on.
Thank you. This place rules.
Hopefully, he'll be coming again in the future. But until then, you guys have a good night, and may we see each other again at TPC on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Thank you, guys.